It's the AFC Champions League final, the second leg. Guangzhou Evergrande up against FC Seoul. Korean sides have absolutely dominated this competition. Elkerson to put this ahead, and he does! The trophy for the AFC Champions League 2013 to be given a Turk chair. Guangzhou Evergrande.
Throughout the 2010s, the impending era of Chinese dominance was almost unquestionable. A booming economy, a massive workforce, a rising diplomatic power, and a small piece of that was found here, on the soccer pitch, where Guangzhou Evergrande won 7 titles in a row from 2011 to 2017. They opened a soccer development camp intending to create a pipeline of players that would win China a World Cup in the coming years. Evergrande, the real estate giant behind the soccer club, began building a 100,000-person stadium that would be one of the marvels of the world. You may recognize the name Evergrande. In fact, if you have heard that name, it probably was only in reference to a collapsed real estate giant that has become the face of a drastic decline in one of China's most important industries. But the problems in China's property market go far deeper than one collapsed corporation. The crisis creates a tangled web that will be difficult to unravel and has far-reaching effects beyond China's borders, to over a dozen countries whose own economies may fail as a result. Evergrande rose to power starting in 1996 as the country pushed to move hundreds of millions of people from the countryside into cities. Evergrande bought hundreds of parcels of land and started building apartment buildings. They became the top developer in China, with over 1,300 developments in 280 cities. Real estate development is responsible for 30% of China's GDP, and home ownership accounts for between 70 to 80% of individual wealth in the country. By the 2010s, the company was involved not only in real estate, but in electric vehicle development, traditional Chinese medicine, and soccer, with dreams of fighting Tesla and bringing the World Cup to China. Evergrande's soccer camp academy spread over 300 acres, with 24 Spanish coaches who came from a partnership with Real Madrid, training students 6 days a week. To fuel these ambitions, Evergrande borrowed money. They borrowed a lot, and to be fair, so did every other developer in China. But that was okay, because business was booming. In China, not only is property seen as a good investment, but home ownership is often a prerequisite for marriage, on top of the state's continued efforts to urbanize the country, creating a need for more homes. Following the financial crisis of 2008, China dumped government stimulus into a lot of manufacturing, such as steel and cement firms. That meant that materials were cheap. The state was pouring money into the construction industry to boost the economy, and the Chinese people had huge incentives to buy homes. In the 2010s, the Chinese state began to realize that marriage and urbanization rates, as well as China's overall population, were falling. They reduced lending to real estate developers, but private institutions stepped in to bridge the gap. Finally, in 2020, regulators put a cap on how much developers could borrow, but by then, it was too late. The housing market had slowed, in addition to the significant economic effects of China's zero-COVID policies, and Evergrande, and other developers like them, found themselves drowning in debt payments. Unable to make payments on their debt, Evergrande filed for bankruptcy, causing their shares to plummet 99% since a high in July 2020. The collapse of the property market was inevitable, but the plan going forward for recovery is deeply complicated and full of contradictions. The first problem is that China has too many homes. China has tried to make homes more appealing by cutting interest rates and mandatory deposits, but housing prices also need to drop. But when 80% of the household wealth in your country is tied to home ownership, the prospect of houses dropping in value is extremely unappealing to much of the country. Additionally, local governments make huge profits off of selling property to real estate developers so they can build more homes, something that local governments need more than ever, as they're in trillions of dollars of debt after surviving through zero-COVID lockdowns for the last few years. Furthermore, 80 to 90% of the Chinese real estate market is based on new builds. But with property developers dropping left and right, Chinese buyers don't have the confidence to pre-buy a new build from a company that may not exist in a few months. But the problems don't stop there. 12% of the housing market, or about 50 million homes, sit vacant, held as an investment to be sold once their value appreciates. In China, unlike other parts of the world, the value of a house drops the second it's occupied, like driving a new car off the lot. Were the value of houses to fall significantly, owners would be incentivized to sell, flooding the market more than it already is. And so this brings us to our next point. If 30% of your GDP is linked to a failing industry, what do? You call in your debts. China has called in their debts from around a dozen countries in the developing world, leading to economic instability. Zambia and Sri Lanka have already gone into default. Since Sri Lanka's default, 500,000 jobs have vanished, inflation has risen above 50%, and nearly half the population of the country has fallen into poverty. Zambia has suffered similar effects, with its currency losing 30% of its value in 7 months, and the estimate of citizens who are starving has tripled. Pakistan has had to lay off millions of textile workers because they cannot afford to keep the electricity on to run the machines, as well as having to break ranks with the United States to buy discounted oil from Russia to prevent more blackouts. Kenya has been unable to pay government workers. In most cases, loans such as these are public record. If a country is set to default, other lenders can step in to give relief, or the original lender can forgive some of the debt. In China's case, both the amount and terms of the loan are secret, meaning that other countries or agencies find it much more difficult to step in and help. Furthermore, the IMF has chosen not to issue low-interest loans that are going straight towards paying interest on Chinese debt. Although Chinese current economic troubles are not the only reason for their stance on foreign debt, it's not a stretch to assume that part of their approach is due to a need for funds at home. China has often been known as one of the world's most unforgiving lenders, and in this case, it's no different. China did not qualify for the World Cup in Qatar. Their 300-acre football academy only ever produced one graduate that played for Guangzhou Evergrande for a grand total of 5 minutes. The 100,000 capacity stadium sits half-finished, seized by the state to help account for some of Evergrande's massive debt. And Evergrande FC, after winning 8 titles in 10 years, was relegated in 2022. The collapse of the Chinese real estate market and the developers that fueled it signal not only the end of China's World Cup hopes, but a harsh new reality for its people, and a dire future for many countries in the developing world. But there is some hope, at least for China. The property sector has been building a bubble destined to burst for years, artificially inflating the economy by building more homes than were needed. Although the collapse is disastrous and may take a decade to fix, it will force China to diversify its economy, leading to a better, healthier Chinese economy in the long run. What price the people of China and of other countries that rely on Chinese debt will have to pay in the meantime is yet to be seen.